It had been a grueling match, the kind of high-stakes game that left every muscle in Mohamed Salah's body aching. His mind, too, was weary from the tension, the pressure, the expectations that seemed to follow him wherever he went. All he wanted now was to escape the chaos, to find solace in the quiet of a hotel room, a place where he could just breathe. The flight had been long, the hours endless, but finally he was here, standing at the entrance of one of the most luxurious hotels in the city. It was meant to be a simple stopover, a brief moment of rest before moving on to the next challenge. As Salah stepped into the hotel lobby, the polished marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting. The air was filled with the faint scent of fresh flowers and the murmur of quiet conversation. It was everything you would expect from a place of this caliber. His arrival should have been met with the usual routine: a friendly smile, a swift check-in, the keys to a room where he could finally unwind. But something felt off. There was an edge to the air, a subtle shift in the energy around him that immediately caught his attention. The staff, all impeccably dressed, greeted him with their usual professionalism, but Salah could sense their hesitation. The receptionist smiled politely, offering a quick nod. "Good evening, Mr. Salah. Welcome. Your reservation is ready." But the words didn't carry the warmth he had grown accustomed to during his travels. There was something almost mechanical in her tone. A flicker of discomfort danced across her eyes before she quickly lowered her gaze, avoiding direct contact. It was subtle, but enough to make Salah pause. He was no stranger to being recognized, to the hushed whispers of excitement that followed him everywhere he went. But this was different. This wasn't the usual awe or respect. This felt colder. He handed over his ID, expecting the process to be as smooth as any other stay. But as the receptionist scanned his details, her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. A brief moment of tension passed before she glanced up at him, her face tight, almost unreadable. "I'm sorry, Mr. Salah," she said, her voice now laced with uncertainty, "but there seems to be an issue with your reservation." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but Salah kept his expression steady. He had faced worse, hadn't he? Hadn't he battled far more intense challenges on the field? This would be no different. But the unease spreading across the room told a different story, one he hadn't anticipated. Salah could feel the tension building with every passing second. The air in the lobby, which had once been calm and inviting, now felt stifling, thick with an unspoken weight. He watched as the receptionist's fingers hovered nervously over the keyboard, her eyes flicking back and forth between the screen and his face. The brief silence stretched on longer than it should have, each second adding to the discomfort that seemed to ripple through the room. He took a step closer to the desk, his gaze steady, searching for an explanation. But none came. The receptionist's lips pressed together tightly as she continued to scan the screen. Her eyes were darting around now, as though trying to avoid meeting his gaze for too long. Salah stood still, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had done this countless times before. Checked into hotels, signed forms, received room keys. Why was this any different? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the receptionist looked up, her hands shaking slightly, as she pushed a keycard toward him. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Salah," she said, her voice strained. "There seems to be a problem with your reservation. I'm afraid hotel policy doesn't allow us to accommodate your stay." The words hit him like a cold splash of water. Salah blinked, his body freezing in place. For a split second, he couldn't comprehend what she was saying. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice controlled, but there was an undeniable edge to it now. He could feel the weight of the moment. Something wasn't right. The receptionist swallowed hard, her lips trembling. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "There's an unspoken rule," she muttered, her eyes flicking nervously to the manager who had just entered the lobby, his presence looming over them like a shadow. Salah's eyes narrowed, a flicker of realization dawning in his chest. He knew what was happening. It wasn't about policy. It wasn't about any official rules or regulations. It was personal. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. A quiet, calculated attempt to humiliate him. His reputation, his success, all of it had become a threat in the eyes of people who didn't even know him. For a moment he considered walking away, but Salah wasn't the kind of man to back down. Not now, not ever. The manager stepped forward, offering a tight, rehearsed smile. I'm afraid there's nothing we can do. Our hands are tied, he said, his voice cold, dismissive. Salah stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't going to be moved. Not by prejudice, not by fear, not by anyone who thought they could diminish him. He held the manager's gaze, his jaw clenched tight, a storm of emotions raging inside him, but he said nothing. The silence between them was deafening. Salah's mind raced as he processed the receptionist's words, but his voice remained steady. What do you mean by unspoken rule? What's the actual issue here? He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, trying to pierce through the vague explanation she had offered. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension mounting with each passing second. The receptionist looked at him, her face flushed, and for the first time, he saw her hesitate. She opened her mouth, but the words seemed to get stuck in her throat. Her fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the computer screen, her eyes darting nervously between Salah and the other hotel staff, who were now quietly watching the exchange. I'm not sure, she muttered, her voice faltering. It's just the policy, Mr. Salah. She looked to her side, where the manager had positioned himself, watching with a carefully neutral expression. Salah could feel the coldness of his gaze, the silent judgment in the air. The manager cleared his throat, stepping forward with an air of practiced indifference. What she means is there are certain individuals we're unable to accommodate due to specific concerns. It's nothing personal, just hotel policy. His words were slick, rehearsed, but Salah could see the subtle shift in his posture. This was personal. Salah's stomach twisted. He could hear the faint murmur of voices from behind the desk, the hushed whispers circulating among the staff. He could feel the subtle shift in the room as the others began to acknowledge the situation. Something had changed. He wasn't just a famous footballer now, a man who had brought his team victory after victory, a man who had become a symbol of pride. Now he was a problem, an inconvenience to the powers that be in this hotel. Salah stood motionless for a moment, fighting the urge to snap, to demand answers that might only deepen the chasm between them. The manager's posture was stiff, his eyes cold, but there was more than that. The receptionist's nervousness, the sidelong glances, the way the whispers behind the desk grew louder. The truth was clearer than ever now. This wasn't a matter of hotel policy. It wasn't about rules or regulations. It was about something deeper, something rooted in the way they viewed him. A quiet, unspoken prejudice that had nothing to do with his career or his achievements, but everything to do with who he was and who they decided he wasn't. The realization hit Salah like a punch to the gut. He had been here before, on the pitch, facing opposition that wasn't just about the game. It was personal. But this was different. This wasn't about a match. This wasn't about beating an opponent. This was about standing his ground in the face of something much darker. And in that moment, as the whispers circled and the tension in the air thickened, Salah knew he wasn't going to leave. Not without a fight. The moment Salah's gaze locked with the manager's, a cold realization settled in. This wasn't just about a room. This wasn't even about an unspoken rule. It was personal. He could see it now in the manager's eyes, in the way the receptionist's shoulders had tensed, in the hushed voices of the staff who had now stopped pretending. The hotel, with all its luxurious promises, had drawn a line, and Salah had crossed it simply by being who he was. The manager stepped closer, his suit crisply pressed, every movement deliberate as though he was savoring this moment of control. I understand this must be frustrating for you, Mr. Salah, he said, his tone dripping with insincerity. But the rules are clear, and unfortunately, we cannot make exceptions. The words hung in the air like a bitter taste, each syllable meant to make Salah feel small. Perhaps another hotel would be better suited for your specific needs. Salah's mind screamed for an answer, some sharp retort to cut through the man's condescension. But he stood still, breathing evenly, letting the words sink in. The truth was, this wasn't about the rules. The hotel had decided that someone like him didn't belong, not just because of his fame, not because of his accolades, but because of the silent bias that had worked its way into the very fabric of this place. He could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating, the weight of an invisible barrier built on prejudice and fear. He stood in silence, letting the moment stretch out. He wasn't going to lash out. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him crumble under the weight of their assumptions. Salah knew better than to react out of anger. He had faced this before, not just on the football field, but in life. People who underestimated him. People who thought they knew his limits. They all learned the hard way that Salah didn't break. He just adapted, and he learned. But in this moment, he had to choose whether to let this man's words define him or to simply rise above. The manager's eyes narrowed, waiting for a response, expecting a confrontation. But Salah didn't move. He didn't speak. Instead, he turned slightly, casting a glance around the room. His silence spoke volumes, louder than any word he could have said. The staff shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact, others standing rigidly, caught between their duty and the clear discomfort in the air. Salah could see it now. The power dynamics at play, the way the hotel had positioned itself, the way it had made him feel like an outsider in a space that should have welcomed him. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the air began to shift. The manager faltered, unsure of how to continue. Salah remained calm, his body still and steady, the epitome of quiet strength in the face of unwarranted hostility. He didn't need to fight, he didn't need to argue. His presence alone was enough to expose the truth of the situation. The tension in the air was palpable, like a storm about to break. The manager, now sensing his own power slipping away, leaned forward, his eyes sharp, trying to provoke a reaction from Salah. The room, once filled with the hum of quiet conversations and soft footsteps, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The staff, unsure of what to do, watched in uneasy silence. They were all expecting Salah to lose his composure, to shout, to throw the kind of tantrum that would validate their preconceived notions about who he was, a footballer, a celebrity, someone who could be dismissed with a simple flick of the wrist. But Salah didn't flinch. His gaze was steady, his posture unshaken. The anger that churned inside him, the indignation at being treated like an intruder in a place that should have been welcoming, threatened to rise. It would have been so easy to let it explode, to call out the injustice, to make a scene and let the world see the truth of what was happening. But Salah knew that would only play into their hands. He wasn't some hot-headed athlete who could be reduced to a headline or a viral moment. He was a man of principles, of dignity. The manager's attempt to further escalate the situation only made Salah's resolve stronger. He could hear the sneers in the manager's voice, the dismissive undertone that dripped with arrogance, but he refused to be drawn into it. Instead of reacting with anger, Salah stood taller, his eyes unwavering. The whispers in the room grew louder, but he didn't flinch. His silence was his strength. "Mr. Salah," the manager continued, his voice tinged with impatience, "this is not the place for individuals like you." His words were like a slap meant to strip Salah of his dignity, to force him to cower. But Salah didn't give him the satisfaction. He didn't need to respond with words. His silence was enough. With a controlled breath, Salah turned slowly, facing the crowd of employees and onlookers that had gathered, watching with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The manager's eyes narrowed, and Salah knew he was expecting a fight. But Salah's response was not one of rage. Instead, he addressed the room quietly, his voice firm but calm. "I'm not here to make trouble," he said. "I'm here to show respect. And I will leave with my dignity intact whether you choose to recognize it or not." The room was still, every eye locked on him. The manager stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed. Salah's simple act of refusing to stoop to their level of provocation was enough. He wasn't going to let this hotel or anyone in it drag him into the chaos they expected. With one last steady breath, Salah turned and walked out of the lobby. He didn't need to make a scene. He had already won. Salah turned his back to the manager, his footsteps echoing in the now silent lobby. Every inch of his body told him to keep walking, to leave the injustice behind him, and simply move on. But something inside him refused to let it go. He wasn't just going to let them think they had won. This wasn't about him getting a room anymore. This was about something bigger, a silent protest, a stand for dignity, for every person who had ever been made to feel less than they were, simply because of who they were. Salah wasn't about to let that moment slip away without making sure his voice was heard. He moved past the reception desk, ignoring the stares from the gathered staff and guests who had turned their attention to him. He could feel the weight of their gazes, some laced with curiosity, others filled with discomfort. A few whispered to each other, but Salah kept his focus forward, the sting of their treatment still simmering under the surface. As he approached the lobby's phone, he took a deep breath. His fingers brushed against the receiver, a simple action, but it was enough. He wasn't going to let this moment end in silence. Without looking back, he lifted the phone to his ear, his movements deliberate, measured. The quiet hum of the hotel's background noise faded into the distance as he dialed the number on the card in his hand. He didn't need to raise his voice, he didn't need to scream. His message was clear, calm, and powerful. "I need to speak with the manager of this establishment," he said. His tone firm but not laced with anger. It was an even voice, one that carried authority but remained steady. "I have been denied a stay, and I need to understand why." As he waited, the tension in the lobby seemed to grow. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, and Salah could feel the weight of their discomfort. He wasn't looking for a confrontation, but he wasn't going to let them dismiss him either. This wasn't about an apology or the room he had been promised. It was about accountability, about ensuring that this kind of treatment didn't go unnoticed. He knew that the hotel's management would likely try to bury the issue, sweep it under the rug, but Salah wasn't going to allow that. He was going to make them confront it, to deal with the consequences of their actions. When the line clicked and the voice on the other end finally answered, Salah's response was as calm and composed as ever. "I am Mohamed Salah. I just tried to check into your hotel, but I was told I couldn't stay here. I would like to know why, and I would like an immediate resolution." The voice on the other end faltered, and for a brief moment Salah could hear the weight of realization set in. This wasn't just another guest on the other side of the line. This was Mohamed Salah, and he wasn't leaving until he had answers. And in that moment, Salah understood something powerful. His calm wasn't a weakness. It was his greatest strength. As Salah stood by the phone waiting for the manager to respond, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted. The staff who had once stood by in quiet judgment now exchanged looks, uneasy, uncertain, perhaps even guilty. The whispers, though still faint, began to spread among the guests. Eyes that had been trained on Salah in curiosity now lingered on him with a new understanding. What had started as an isolated incident was no longer just about him. It had become something bigger, something much more powerful. Salah remained calm, his voice steady as he continued his quiet phone call, refusing to let the situation escalate into chaos. But as he spoke, a change began to stir. A few guests who had been watching the interaction from their seats started to stand. At first, it was just one man, a businessman in a sharp suit who walked up to the reception desk and asked, "Is this how you treat your guests? With such blatant disrespect?" His words were quiet but cutting, his voice tinged with disbelief. The receptionist, still rattled, avoided his gaze. Another guest, a woman in her 50s with a kind face, followed suit. "This isn't right," she said, her voice rising just enough for those nearby to hear. "No one should be treated like this, no matter who they are." The ripple had begun. One by one, other guests who had been silent until then started to speak up. Their voices, though quiet, were united in a simple message. What had happened to Salah was wrong. They were no longer willing to be passive observers. They weren't just standing with him. They were standing against the injustice they had all witnessed. Salah's restraint, his calm in the face of blatant prejudice, had sparked something in them. They saw in his quiet dignity a strength that went beyond what most could understand. And it resonated. The manager, who had been watching the scene unfold, looked uncomfortable now, his eyes darting between the gathering group and the receptionist. Salah's composed silence had somehow turned the tide, and what had once been a private battle between him and the hotel was now a public display of solidarity. A few guests moved closer to Salah, offering nods of support. One of them, a young man in a t-shirt, smiled at him. "Don't let them treat you like this," he said softly, his words simple but heartfelt. Salah, still holding the phone, turned slightly to acknowledge the growing group around him. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes, grateful but focused, spoke volumes. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about all of them, about the belief that everyone, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. And as the support for Salah grew, it became clear that the hotel was losing control of the narrative. What had begun as a moment of quiet defiance had now turned into a wave of unexpected unity, one that the hotel's management would have a hard time ignoring. The hotel manager's calm facade had cracked. The murmurs of the guests, their voices rising in support of Salah, had forced him into a corner, one where the weight of his actions bore down on him like a suffocating cloud. His eyes darted across the lobby, watching as more and more guests gathered in solidarity, their presence now an unmistakable condemnation of everything he had allowed to unfold. He could feel the heat of the moment, the stares burning into him, and for the first time, he was unsure of how to proceed. He had thought the matter would blow over, that Salah would simply leave, that no one would care. But as word spread and more guests began to speak out, it became painfully clear just how wrong he had been. The manager's thoughts scrambled for some semblance of control. How could this have gotten so out of hand? The pressure built, the realization sinking in slowly. He had made a mistake that couldn't be erased with a simple apology or a change of policy. The damage was already done. Behind the reception desk, the staff had grown more nervous, their uncertainty palpable as they avoided eye contact with the growing group of supporters. A few had already begun to murmur about their own discomfort with the situation, the atmosphere growing thick with regret. But it was too late. The guests who had spoken out, who had defended Salah with their voices and their presence, weren't backing down. The manager's earlier decision to deny Salah's reservation based on something as petty as personal bias now felt like a bad decision wrapped in shame. He turned sharply, finally addressing the issue at hand, his voice tight with the weight of the situation. "Mr. Salah," he began, his tone now far less authoritative, I apologize for the way things have been handled." He swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure, but it was clear he knew the apology was just words, hollow against the magnitude of what had happened. Salah, standing tall and composed in the center of it all, simply raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. He had already said everything with his silence, with his calm demeanor. The manager's hands shook slightly as he fumbled for the right words, but nothing he could say would take back the actions of that afternoon. His mind raced for a way to undo the mess he had created, but with every passing second, the reality of the situation became more obvious. It wasn't just about a room anymore. It was about pride, dignity, and the truth of who they had tried to push out. Salah's presence, the quiet strength he exuded, had turned the tide. What had been an attempt to humiliate him now stood as a testament to his resilience and the power of a few voices speaking out against injustice. The manager standing before him could no longer escape the truth. The damage had been done, and it was too late to fix it. The phone calls came in waves, each one more urgent than the last. The hotel manager, still reeling from the growing backlash, could hardly keep up. The press had caught wind of the situation, and before long, every major outlet had picked up the story. Social media was alive with hashtags and posts, as influencers, guests, and onlookers all joined the growing chorus of outrage. The messages were loud and clear. What had happened to Salah was wrong, and the hotel had crossed a line. The manager sat in his office, his hands clenched around the phone, trying to navigate the damage control, but it was clear that it was slipping out of his grasp. The corporate office had called, demanding an explanation, and it wasn't long before they made their decision. An apology had to be issued, immediately. The pressure to make things right, or at least appear to, was overwhelming. The email came just as the manager had finished another call with an angry journalist. It was brief, to the point. The company had instructed him to publicly apologize, not just to Salah, but to every guest who had witnessed the injustice unfold. The words were carefully chosen, polished to seem genuine, though the reality was that the apology felt far too late to carry any real weight. But the corporate office had made their move, and now it was time to try to salvage what was left of the hotel's reputation. Minutes later, the manager approached Salah again, his posture less confident than it had been before. Salah, still calm, had been speaking to a few of the guests, quietly thanking them for their support when the manager arrived. The tension was palpable, but now there was something different in the air, an uncomfortable shift. Salah didn't look up as the manager cleared his throat. "Mr. Salah," the manager said, his voice hesitant, "on behalf of the hotel, I would like to offer you a complimentary stay, as a gesture of goodwill, and to make amends for the way you were treated." The words hung in the air, but Salah didn't react. He had heard this before. The hotel had been forced into this apology, into offering something that didn't truly address the heart of the matter. Salah's silence was telling. He didn't need to say it. He knew that this wasn't about a free room anymore. It had never been about the room. The offer, though generous, now felt hollow. It was a response born from fear, from the pressure of an audience that would not let this incident slide. Salah's calm gaze met the manager's, but there was no anger, no frustration in his eyes. Only an understanding that had grown deeper with every moment of this ordeal. He nodded slowly, but he didn't accept the offer right away. "Thank you," Salah said quietly, his voice as composed as ever. "But this is no longer about where I sleep tonight." His words were simple but carried a weight that the manager couldn't escape. Salah had already made his point. The room, the apology, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the hotel had tried to erase him, and now the world was watching. This wasn't just about one man's dignity, it was about accountability. As Salah turned to leave, the manager stood there, speechless, fully aware that the damage couldn't be undone by a free night stay or a forced apology. The truth had already been spoken loud and clear. The hotel manager stood there, his apology hanging in the air like a futile gesture. The tension in the lobby, thick with uncomfortable silence, seemed to grow even heavier with every passing second. Salah's composed silence spoke volumes, far louder than any apology the hotel could offer. As he stood there, the weight of the situation settled around him, and it was clear. This moment wasn't about a room, a stay, or a free offer. It was about something much deeper. Salah had never been a man to seek revenge or vindication. His dignity, his character, were things that no one could take from him, no matter how hard they tried. The hotel could offer him a room, but it couldn't offer him respect. Respect that he had already earned, that he had never lost, and that in this moment was more powerful than any material gesture they could make. Salah's eyes met the manager's, but there was no hint of anger in his gaze, no fury, no sense of humiliation. Just a quiet strength, a resolve that cut through the tension like a blade. "I don't need your apology," he said simply, his voice calm and steady. "You can keep your offer. It's not about that. It's about how you treat people, and that's something you can't just fix with a room." The manager opened his mouth, perhaps to say something more, but Salah turned away before he could speak. He didn't need to say anything else. The lesson had been delivered. Salah's refusal to be degraded had already resonated with everyone in the room, from the onlookers to the staff who had silently witnessed the entire exchange. The apology, the offer, they were meaningless in the face of the larger truth. Salah had chosen dignity over anger, resilience over defeat, and in doing so, he had become the real winner of this moment. As he walked toward the exit, there was no fanfare, no dramatic exit. It wasn't necessary. Salah didn't need the applause or the attention. He knew as he stepped out into the night that his actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. His decision to rise above, to reject the shame that the hotel had tried to place on him, had already set the tone. He didn't need a room, he didn't need an apology. What he had was his integrity, and that was more powerful than anything they could have offered. The lobby behind him felt still, like the air after a storm, the ripples of what had just happened still echoing. Salah had taught everyone present a lesson that went far beyond the walls of that hotel. It was a lesson in character, in standing tall against unfairness, and in refusing to let anyone strip you of your worth. As he disappeared into the night, the truth was clear: dignity wins.